Welcome, listeners, to Beyond the Crucible, and you have come at what we hope you know is a very special time for the show, and that is we are in the midst of a series that we're calling Harnessing Resilience. This is episode 5 of 6, which my calculator just tells me is 83% of all the shows that we're going to be doing on harnessing resilience here. So this is episode 5 of 6. And what we're talking about here is ways in which we can manifest, harness, develop, strengthen, find, increase our aptitude in leveraging resilience to overcome our crucibles. And as we talk about all the time on the show, crucible experiences are those things that happen in life, traumas, tragedies, setbacks, failures, those things that knock the wind out of your sails, can knock you off your feet, can make it seem as if, and oftentimes do, change the trajectory of your life. But as we always say, this show's got good news because we don't just talk about them here on the show so we can build a virtual campfire and get together and share war stories. We talk about them to offer hope that they can be gotten beyond, hence the title of the show, Beyond the Crucible. And we're specifically talking here about resilience during this series because that is a critical piece of what it takes to bounce, not just beyond through your crucible, but beyond it, and to live as our founder at Crucible Leadership and the host of the show, Warwick Fairfax, says, to live a life of significance. Speaking of the founder of Crucible Leadership and the host of Beyond the Crucible, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, welcome to part 5 of Harnessing Resilience.
Thanks, Gary. Very much looking forward to this.
So our guest today, listener, is Craig Dowden. Craig has a PhD, and he is an inspiring and thought-provoking executive coach, Forbes author, and keynote speaker who partners with leaders and executives to tackle their most important personal and organizational challenges. Craig holds a doctorate in psychology with a concentration in business and is a certified positive psychology coach. In his role as a trusted advisor, he integrates the latest findings in the science of leadership, team, and organizational excellence into his coaching and consulting work. He also specifically focuses on, in his speaking, building resilience. And that is the deep well we're going to mine today. So Warwick, the first pickaxe move is yours.
Well, Craig, thank you so much, and love all your work and on resilience. And obviously, you've also written a book, Do Good to Lead Well, which we'll have to have you on again to talk about. I love the concept of leaders often believe they can be values driven or they can be successful by just the whole concept of doing good and, to lead well. It's, values driving your leadership, a great concept. But we're here today to talk about resilience. And we live in a pandemic-ridden world where everything's so uncertain. If ever we needed resilience, it's it. And, one of the things I'd like to start off with, you have this great phrase in which you say that, our ability to bounce back, what your definition of resilience is our ability to bounce back, how quickly we take to bounce back to baseline in order to move ahead. Talk about just this concept of moving back to baseline to move ahead and what your definition of resilience, and just sort of give us an overview as we get into the subject.
Well, thanks so much, Warwick and Gary, for inviting me on your podcast. And it's such an important topic. And I love the thesis of what you have in terms of, well, it's about what happens when we encounter these events and how do we push forward? And I think that's really critical, and appreciate that question because that comes from the decades of research that have been conducted around. So what does resilience look like? What does it mean when we're talking about resilience? And fundamentally, across all of the different pieces of research, it's essentially how quickly we bounce back to quote unquote normal, and how do we move ahead after we encounter challenging events. So it makes a whole lot of sense because the quicker that I can restabilize and then move forward with purpose, well, then now that by definition represents enhanced resiliency. And the longer that takes, the longer that recovery period, the more challenging it is, well, then the less resilient I am. Because once I get back to that balanced state, now I'm able to step forward with intentionality.
And that's such a good point. I think you used the image of a slinky, which some of us remember from our childhood, going down the stairs, and just this sort of elasticity, this flexibility. Talk about what does that mean, sort of elasticity, flexibility in enabling us to get back to baseline as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. And I think invariably when we encounter setbacks, it's really challenging. It's tough, and we can feel we can get into that negative mindset and cycle around that. And yet, from the neuroscientific research and elsewhere, we as human beings are far more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. And we can come back from these pieces. And what's critical is to shifting our thinking, shifting our emotional management system, if you will, in terms of reframing things. Daniel Gilbert out of Harvard University talks about how his research has shown how much more resilient we are. When you ask people to anticipate how they're going to respond when a particular challenge comes up, one of the worst imagined scenarios possible, and they think, oh, I won't be able to do this. When the moment comes, we are extraordinarily resilient. We are able to dig deep and move forward. And I think and appreciate your appreciation of the slinky, because that's fundamentally it. It continues to move, it can get stretched, and then the critical part is it reforms and moves ahead each step. So it's a really great metaphor for us in terms of how we approach our lives and how we move.
I want to jump in for a second and emphasize a point so clear in the beginning of this discussion, because we've done now, gracious, we're in the mid 80s for the number of shows we've done, Craig. And one of the things we hear from time to time when we're talking to a guest who's been through a crucible, they talk about how it's not about bouncing back, because they say, bouncing back means you're just back to where you were. You're saying, though, something I think somewhat different. It's a both and. You have to bounce back to where you were first. Then part two of the process is bouncing forward from there. Is that a fair enough layman's understanding of what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think it's a great way of looking at it, because also one of the interesting things we talked about at the beginning, right, about being in the midst of a pandemic, and one of the key insights from a lot of the thought leaders and researchers is that how agile are we? How adaptive are we to those circumstances? And I think what's critical is that when, again, invariably things aren't always going to go our way or turn out as planned. And then when we return to baseline, that's fantastic. And now it's, how do I take the insight, the learning, the teachings that experience has shown to me, and now integrate that into the future? So now I'm better equipped to deal with similar challenges or the same challenges. And this is where I find, and to me, the research in this space is fascinating around mindset and perspective, is around, so now how do we evolve? How do we grow as individuals once we've encountered this particular situation? And I think that's where there's even additional motivation, right? Is that, so now I can expand myself as a human being and my capacity.
I mean, what's interesting is we've had, every guest we've had on is, almost like a superstar in resilience. I mean, their mindset is unbelievable, I can think of just a few stories that really illustrate, I think, the point you're making about mindset. I can think of somebody that we didn't have on the podcast, Johnny Erickson Tada, who, has a, top-rated Christian podcast, or at least Christian radio program, certainly did have. And she became a quadriplegic in the 60s in a diving accident in Maryland, funnily enough, where I live most of the year. And it took a while, and she's been in that wheelchair for got to be 50 plus years, and she says something that makes no sense. She talks about her wheelchair as a passport to joy. That to me makes no sense. It's almost obscene to say that. Now there's mental shifts, and then there's crazy mental shifts. That makes no sense. But, we've had a woman recently, an Australian woman that was injured in a diving accident, became a quadriplegic at 12, has some movement now, and she talks about how it was a gift, I mean, it's just, there's this sense of some of these folks that obviously nobody wants to go through that kind of physical crucible, but they've used it, they've reframed it in an unbelievable way to help them move forward. So talk about this. Not everybody's going to talk about that. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing, but it seems like reframing and seeing value in what you've gone through and being able to use it to help others. There's something about that really helps you not just come back, but spring forward a whole heck of a long way. Does that make sense from your perspective?
Absolutely makes sense. And I think what's crucial around that, it's also, and this is where sometimes it can, as you say, just seem completely out of bounds to frame it that way. And I think sometimes that can, again, that profound search for, okay, like, look how great this is. It's not meant to minimize the experience. And I think that's the other piece about it, right? Because because it is challenging. It can be extraordinarily traumatic, and it's essential. And decades of psychological research highlight that as well. It's essential for us to acknowledge our emotions and accept them, not try to move past them too quickly. Right. And then I think once we've gone through that, then the power is, and you make such an important point, Warwick, which is around, okay, so now what do I do? How do I move forward? What are just like the pandemic, really interesting. I facilitate CEO forums and leadership forums. And one of the powerful questions that we've reflected on and talked about is that, okay, what are some of the insights? What are some of the benefits of this experience through the pandemic? So people talking about, I spent more time with my kids, or now I'm much more reflective about how much time I'm going to spend in airports and what kinds of meetings do I need to go to versus not. And so it doesn't mean that the pandemic has been joyful and wonderful, yet at the same time, there are things from it that, hey, it's shifted my perspective. And I love that you talk about that mindset shift. And as another quick example, remember speaking to the CEO on one of my webinar series of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association here in Canada. And she talked about, she reports to a board of 40 members. And people were saying, yeah, exactly. Oh boy, like 6 or 8 is challenging enough. Right. Like now you have 40. And she had such a powerful insight where she said, well, you know what I do is I choose to look at them as 40 really smart, highly accomplished people who are looking out for my best interests and the best interest of my organization. And now, rather than fear the exchanges or try to avoid it, what she does is look to facilitate relationships. And I think, again, the same situation can be viewed very, very differently. And so looking at what can we control, what do we move forward, what do we learn through this experience? And again, decades of research has shown us that we are incredibly meaning-making creatures. As human beings, that's something that defines us. And I love, again, the core thesis around moving ahead with purpose that you talk about. That is at our core as people. And so now finding ways to be able to do that successfully, once again, doesn't minimize the experience, it enhances it, and it brings us forward in a different way.
It's so true. And really, we've had maybe 70, 80 guests on the podcast, and this is, I guess, qualitative, not quantitative research, but qualitatively, every single guest who has bounced back, whether it's a physical tragedy or a business failure or victims of abuse, every variety, we've had different, genders, race, nationalities. They've all sought to seek meaning in their crucible, and they've all bounced forward, if you will, by looking at it in terms of how can I use what I've been through to help others, whether it's other victims of abuse, other people with physical challenges, other people have had a business failure. Every one of them, they've not held grudges, because that can pull you down. It's, as we often say on Crucible Leadership, lack of forgiving other people puts you in prison. It's almost like drinking poison. It's not good for you, irrespective of how bad and how wrong other people may have been to you in that incident. But just this concept of, using what you've been through to serve others, to serve a bigger purpose from your perspective, does that show up in the research too as being one of the factors in resilience and bouncing back?
Absolutely, and in a parallel line of research around accomplishing goals. So in other psychological motivational research, they found the bigger than self goals.
Yes.
Once we look at serving a purpose bigger than ourselves, outside of our own self-interest, and we all have self-interest to some extent, that's absolutely natural and wonderful. And then it's now, how am I contributing to my broader community? How can, and I love the point that you're making, because now what I can do is elevate the meaning that I extract from that challenging experience, because now not only can I grow and extend as a human being and test the limits of my potential, I can also support others in their pursuits. And I can let them know and give them a little bit, a red flag, some warnings in advance. Hey, this tripped me up. And you see that, mentorship, that's a lot around what that is, right? Taking my lived experience and supporting others so that they can not encounter some of the challenges that I did, or adopt different strategies. And the more we can reframe that, look at it in that lens. And I think the power within that as well is that it's more balanced. It's a more balanced perspective on things that, this is, and I love, Gary, you said earlier too, an and idea. This has been incredibly challenging, and I can learn forward from it and move ahead as a more developed individual. I've expanded my toolkit as a result of this experience.
Yeah, that's so well said. I guess in my own way, as listeners would know, growing up in a 150-year-old family business in Australia, and did the $2 billion plus takeover, which made a lot of mistakes. I was fresh out of Harvard Business School, young, foolish, naive, and idealistic. Within 3 years, the company went under. Yeah, that was painful. It took most of the 90s were painful years. Look what I did. I hurt other family members. I'm a person of faith and felt like, gosh, maybe God had a plan, and I blew that, which poor theology, but didn't matter. It was still painful. Lost a lot of money, which wasn't so important to me, but just that sense of loss of self-esteem, self-belief. But eventually I clawed my way back and focused on serving others, and hence with my book coming out this fall, using my pain for a purpose, to use that oft-used aphorism. It's somewhat similar now. Is there still a scar? Of course there is. Do I have regrets? Sure. But yet, when I'm somehow using what I went through to help others, it does make meaning out of it, and it does bring a sense of fulfillment and joy. And so, it's somewhat similar, but you're right. It's not like it wasn't painful. It's not like it didn't take years to bounce back. It's not like, if you read this book and have the right mindset, you can get over this in 5 easy lessons or your money back, in 6 weeks, right? Lose 50 pounds in 4 weeks, guaranteed. It's not, that's not what we or you are saying about resilience. It's not easy. And it can take, in my case, it took years to fully bounce back.
And that's the great thing, I think, that we can't emphasize enough here on the show, and that is there is no statute of limitations on your crucible, on coming back from your crucible. And Warwick, I love that you just described your story. I was sitting here hoping you were going to do it, thinking, am I going to have to jump in and play interviewer and ask Warwick this question? Because your story, as you just expressed it, is what Craig's been talking about, that 1-2 punch, that getting back to baseline, deep breath, and then moving beyond that to that, what you call a life of significance. So we've never looked at it. I don't know. I've never looked at your story in that context before, but it fits perfectly for your story. And while you guys are talking, I'm sitting here going, and that was this guest story and that guest story and that guest story. So clearly the science proves this to be true, right, Craig?
Absolutely. And I think what's really powerful as well, and this is critical, is that the way in which we approach our lives, that's, as you say, Warwick, it's decades, right? These are habits and ingrained frames that we have. And then to move beyond those, I love that you say it, right? It's not we'll follow these 5 steps and in a week, this is a constant level of awareness. And one of the other things that I think is so powerful, resilience is a muscle. So like every leadership is a muscle. And in order for us to grow that muscle, we have to practice it. So if I want to improve my stamina, I got to jump on the treadmill. I got to go for walks. I got to go for jogs. If I want to build lean muscle mass, I got to go in and do the reps. And that resiliency requires intentional practice, dedicated practice, every day looking for opportunities for how can we be more resilient? How can we test ourselves? And that's really crucial. That is one of the key ways in which we can continue to grow and expand. And and opportunities. And here's where I think is so powerful, because you've talked about how the common thread amongst all the guests is, well, look what they've done. Encountered this extraordinary setback, this unbelievable challenge. And then what they've done is figured out a way, okay, so how do I move forward? And they're looking at and we're in the same space for you, what do I take from that? And now how do I move forward within it? So I'm not stuck in the past, or I'm not stuck where I was. Now I'm moving ahead with a very different perspective. And that, as you said earlier, one of the other guys, blessed with that, or that was a passport to me to have a different frame on things. And I think that is what's really key. All of us are going to go through challenging situations. And now the critical choice we all must face is that, okay, what do I do with that? What do I now do that I'm in when I have this crucible moment? And then what's really back to the resilience research, that now I have a choice about how I'm going to respond. And it doesn't take away from the process of mourning, of grief, of frustration, of anger. It's just that now, once I move through that, what do I do? Where do I go from here?
Absolutely. And I want to get to something else you said, but before I do, one of the things you said, I think I love your metaphor of like exercise. It's like a muscle. It's not a one and done thing. Oh, I got over that crucible, I'm good to go. Life keeps hitting at you. Life, it's funny. We had a former prime minister back in the 70s who, in a moment of madness before an election, said life wasn't meant to be easy, which, that's political suicide for a prime minister or president running for re-election. But he did. He might have even been re-elected. I don't know. But wow, crazy talk. But life isn't easy. But, it is like I think of this example, as Gary would know, I don't know, it was a month or two ago. I've largely, gotten over, if you will, air quotes, which for the listeners is better I can. But, the book's coming out, and I guess there's a free chapter available online. And some Australian journalist, gossip columnist, picked it up and read it, and just read a really snarky, column. And it was like, Warwick will give you his advice in his book for a price. It's like, who sells their book for nothing? I mean, come on. And then it's like, well, Warwick will tell you how to bounce back from failure. Well, he's an expert in that, isn't he? It's like one after another snarky comment. Was I bulletproof? No. Did that hurt my feelings? Yes. No, I got over it. I don't know if it took me a few days or whatever. It wasn't immediate, but it's like stuff's going to come at you. And unless you're a machine, and no human being is, at least not with current technology anyway, we're all flesh and blood, it's going to hurt. But the question is, do you wallow there this wasn't worth wallowing for weeks, but, you're going to get hit with something, it's going to hurt your feelings, it's going to take you off the rails. Well, have you built enough resilience muscle and friends, like in this case, Gary, who can say, hey, boy, this hurt my feelings. And, that's part of the muscle is, and I think you talk about this, the internal and the external. But talk a bit about, it's not one and done, and you got to build that muscle so that when stuff comes at you, you know what to do, because your feelings are going to get hurt. Your self-esteem is going to be under assault from time to time. And right, I mean, you write a paper, and let's say 99 people love that peer-reviewed paper, and there's one loon out there somewhere that says, what Craig Dowden, it's stupid, it's idiotic. Well, you might know who that person is, and the guy doesn't have a clue, but it's still going to hurt your feelings, even though the other 99 people said it was brilliant, because you're human, right?
So many amazing things there that you're touching on, Warwick. Number one thing I want to share, back to the science, right? There was a paper done, I think it was about 20 years ago, on the Annual Review of Psychology. And the title was Bad is Stronger Than Good. Mm-hmm. They reviewed about 5 decades of research. we as human beings have a strong negativity bias. So this is why we tend to react more strongly to negative news, right, and stories. And when negative events happen, it's much more challenging for us to recuperate from them when they occur, which is why, once again, that mindset, that perspective, that shift, that dedicated focus. So it's just absolutely natural that's going to happen. And I think, to your point, it's funny, sharing your story. I remember I wrote an article for the Financial Post. First article on national paper here in Canada was online. I was super excited. I was talking about positive leadership, and there were many helpful comments. And then one person said, "Wow, no wonder this guy is shilling positive psychology. I wonder what pays his bills." Right? And I was like, "Whoa, that hurt." And that was the first comment on my column. And then and once again, going back to the science, to the practice of, okay, yeah, I acknowledge that did hurt and it did challenge. And then accept it. The reason that I felt this is that I care about the column and I wanted to add value. And then when I sat back and after, took some time to have that sting and go to people say, "Wow, that was hard," then recognize, okay, my message is not going to connect with everyone, and people are going to have different perspectives, and that's okay. And then and now I can have different conversations as a result. And so that process of, and I think this is really key, and you touched on it as well, Warwick and Gary, is that it's that awareness. So once things happen, fully acknowledge that they're happening and not to run away, not to avoid. And because basically, and this is what I think is so powerful, our emotions are designed, they are the best early warning signal we have. They are absolutely, and one of the things that I talk about with my clients is it's almost like taking a Sherlock Holmesian approach to emotions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whatever is being triggered, in whatever experience we're feeling, our emotions are the most valuable data points we have. And unfortunately, sometimes what we do is then, if we feel we're being irrational, we then judge the emotion and try to not feel it anymore, which is not an effective way to go about it based on the psychological research. What we want to do is exhibit curiosity and say, okay, I totally get I'm feeling irrational about this. 99 people said this was awesome. What's going on with that one person? And now if I can get closer to, and let's link it back to, again, the thesis around the beyond the purposeful, right? Purpose. It's okay. What's the purpose? What's driving my reaction? Now what it does is two things. Number one, I can make a stronger linkage, because as meaning-making creatures, this is important. And now in the future, I can equip myself when someone else has an equally unhelpful thing to say, or even nastier, I can go, okay, I can return back to that, reframe it, and then move forward myself. So I think that kind of, and what's interesting, emotions can be really, we can see them as messy and mucky and unreliable and all these kinds of things, which is, for us, that's what's beautiful about being human. And now when we sit back and look at them with curiosity, it's such a powerful perspective in terms of building our resiliency.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, Craig, is so profound. I want the listeners to really reflect on that. Just the idea of getting in touch with your emotions, and a bit like Sherlock Holmes, as you say, solve the puzzle, solve the case. I mean, again, anecdotally, I'm a very reflective person and analytical, and certainly in the last X amount of years, if I'm feeling bad, I have to know why. I have to know why. And often for me, I've been blessed to be married to my wife a little over 30 years, and our spouses, partners, good friends, family members, they know us, people who you trust, obviously. And I'll say, but I'm feeling down, I'm just not sure why. And after we talk it through, I know, once I know why, then I can do something about it. I mean, it can be as simple as, we have kids from like 30 down to 23, and a few years ago, let's say hypothetically, some of it's not that hard to figure out, but your oldest goes to college. Most parents, or many, will start feeling a little down. Oh, my kids were at home, they're not home anymore. Well, you'll still have that relationship, but it's going to change. So there's certain times in life, and it's okay to feel that. Sometimes it won't be as easy to diagnose, but some people, when they feel bad, they stuff it down. So talk about why, from a research perspective, how stuffing it is not the way to go, and just the value of solving the puzzle, solving the case, understanding what those data points mean and why that's so effective in building resilience.
Well, and it's so powerful, right? Like, let's use a parallel track, because I think this is so compelling. It's like medical research. What's one of the things they tell you, right? Early warning signals, go get it checked out.
Right.
Early intervention is key. Let's go to another area of psychological research, conflict and conflict management. What's one of the top recommendations? Get to it early. When something surfaces, if you and I work, or
Right.
Gary and I are having a challenge, well, it's better for us to talk about it early on, because otherwise, what happens? Does it go away? No, it doesn't. And what does it do? It festers.
That was the exact word I was thinking of. Festers. Good.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is, right? And then once we don't explore it, what's happening with our mindset? Then we're drawing a stronger conclusion around it. What is happening? Now, every time that things are going, now I've got a stronger and stronger frame. So the critical piece for us is just to sit there and say, okay, what are our emotions trying to tell us? We need to figure that out earlier. And then, because if we avoid, what do? We procrastinate. We can engage in maladaptive coping, like binge drinking or binge watching, all kinds of things, which once again, in the moment, may prolong or, extend the time we're going to take before we address it, but it's not addressing that core issue. So it's essential to acknowledge it. And sometimes we're so uncomfortable with our emotions, we try to push them away. It's a natural part of being human. So acknowledge it. And then, to your point, and here's what's really interesting, right? Just to build on the example, okay, my oldest is going to university, going to college. Okay, yeah, I'm feeling that. So I acknowledge that emotion. And this comes from the science of emotions management, right? So acknowledgement is the first step. The second step is acceptance. You know why I'm feeling this emotion? Because I care. I care about, my child is going to university, going off, our relationship is going to shift and adjust, and all those kinds of things. And then I can be mourning the loss of what was and then what's to be. And now afterwards, so that's the first two steps. And then the third one is commit. The energy that I have now from that emotion, I acknowledged it, I accept it. I have activation energy. That's what emotions also provide us. Now I get to choose what to do with that. So if I am, if I'm thinking about, well, my child going off to university or what, I can sit down and say, hey, how are we going to stay in touch? Like, what would work? Da, 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 da. So once again, investing that into a purposeful activity that addresses what's at its core, as opposed to ruminating or procrastinating or trying to avoid it, pretending they're not going to go off. And then what happens? How many times have you heard people say, oh, I wish I had that conversation, or I wish I had done something earlier? So once again, we have this energy. It's part of our natural, biological, and genetic disposition. Well, let's choose to use it wisely.
Hearing you both talk about the dangers of avoidance of our emotions, I'm just going to throw this out here, and this is dangerous because I'm doing it in front of a PhD who can tell me I'm wrong. But it strikes me that, is it in some universe true that avoidance is the opposite of resilience, or in some ways blocks resilience? It's an inhibitor of resilience. So if you're avoiding something, you can't by definition be resilient. Is that close to fair?
I think it's a wonderful linkage. I absolutely agree. And because if, looking at the thesis that resilience is a skill, right, that we can grow. Well, if we're avoiding something, we're not, it's just like being afraid to go to the gym or jump on the treadmill and, I don't want to raise the speed of my treadmill because, what's going to happen if it breaks or I fall off or what? Well, are we going to enhance our cardiovascular health? Well, we're only going to stay at that level. So what's essential is we have to put these things in practice. So I love the linkage you're making, because if we avoid it, we're not doing anything about it. So we're missing an opportunity to be resilient. We're missing an opportunity to explore how could we be resilient. And this is the other piece, because it diversifies our thinking, right? Because there's a lot of different ways in which to approach a particular situation. And the most critical to me, because I think this is another really important point, If we avoid because we feel like we have no other choice but to avoid, that can be incredibly psychologically damaging. If I'm avoiding engaging in a difficult conversation with my boss because I've made an intentional decision that the consequences of moving forward now are going to negatively impact me, that's entirely different. And we may say, hey, the same choice was made. Yes, one was made with intention. One was made with more
Right.
purpose. Again, linking it back, right? Because I can say, you know what? For me, I'm a single income earner for my family, and now we have a more this and that and the other. Okay, I'm in an unfortunate situation. I'm going to choose not to engage on this particular topic. Once again, that's resilience building because I'm making a choice. I'm not avoiding. I'm acknowledging and I'm accepting it. And now I'm choosing to stay. And here are the reasons I'm going to do that. That is, once again, so it can seem almost counterintuitive. You can build resilience even if the choice is, well, I'm not going to take action right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's so profound what you're saying about intentionality and what you're saying, Gary, about, avoidance and resilience being the opposite of resilience. Yeah, I mean, use another analogy. It's like, gardening, you want to get the weeds early before they grow and overwhelm the garden. And, in my own way, I try to do that, but it's just so important. I mean, there's so many elements that are tied together. It's like forgiveness, and if you're bitter against somebody, that grows, and it certainly won't help you be resilient. And sometimes you have family members or friends that I like to call, the gift that keeps on giving. It's like, I've just forgiven you for that. Can you stop because I'm having trouble catching up? Sometimes we're quote unquote blessed with those people. You can't, especially if they're family, there's nothing you can do. You just got to deal with it. But you just have to, again, forgiveness, as we've talked about, it's not so much for other people, it's for your own mental health. It's just whether it's forgiveness, fear, loss of self-esteem, whatever the issue is that's holding you back, the sooner that you deal with it, identify it, and come up with an action plan, whether it's to talk to somebody or not talk to somebody, have an intentional plan that is the way it seems to both mental health and resilience. And, the passive stuff it, not deal with stuff, and letting anger, conflict, loss of self-esteem grow. I mean, that's not going to, you don't want to be endlessly visiting the psychiatrist or psychologist, not because it's good to receive help, but if you're not doing anything and you're making things worse, no professional wants to see somebody endlessly because they're making their life worse. The goal is to heal the patient, not to have a patient that never leaves, because they won't deal with stuff.
Well, and I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I want to build on this is awesome because I love that you talked about forgiveness. And then what I'll play with that and build on it and say self-forgiveness is also extraordinarily important. And then the psychological research, self-compassion. So how do we, again, forgive because we're all human beings. Guess what? I've made, countless numbers of mistakes today, and that's all right. And now the critical part is, okay, so what happens? I encounter a setback. How forgiving am I of myself? And this is what's really interesting too about that research. And again, at work, I'm so glad you talked about forgiving others because that's powerful. And that's a really important linkage for our own resilience, our own mental health. And what's really interesting about the research around self-compassion is that the average person tends to be better at forgiving others than they are forgiving themselves. We tend to give other people far more leeway than we do ourselves. And that counteracts our resilience. That's another core finding in the research. The less self-compassionate we are, the less resilient we are, because what we're doing is holding ourselves up to an incredible standard that we never expect someone else to hold up to meet. And so this is really important. It's essential for us. Again, when we look at this in our relationships, it's relationships with others for sure. And then it's also the relationship we have with ourselves.
Well, unfortunately, profoundly, you are right. And I am, unfortunately, a very good example to justify your thesis. As Gary and listeners would know, with the whole takeover, the most of it was my fault. So in the 90s, most of the pain was, how can I have been such an idiot? I have an undergrad degree from Oxford. I worked on Wall Street. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School. I'm meant to be somewhat intelligent. How could I do that? Okay, I was 26. But then over time, I cut myself a bit of slack. But it took years to get over with. I hurt so many people, or hurt myself, family members. How could I have been so dumb? How could I have been so dumb? How could I have been so dumb? It's like an endless negative mantra. And eventually, through faith, prayer, friends and family and some work I could do and not mess up, I was able to bounce back. But my gosh, for many people, forgiving yourself, gosh, that's hard. And you cannot move forward until it doesn't mean that you don't, if you've wronged other people, yes, there's accountability and restitution, but you've got to find a way to be able to forgive yourself. So,
and we've seen that so often. Listeners, go back in your mind to some of the previous guests we've had on the show. Warwick asks many guests who've gone through crucibles that they played a role in, or they feel they've played a role in, who've had physical traumas, who've had financial traumas, who've had relational traumas. Warwick will ask at some point, did you blame yourself for that? And many of them will say, yeah, but, and then they'll talk about the but is the important part. They'll talk about how they got past that. Initially, they were like that. They blamed themselves like you, Warwick. They were like, oh, it was my fault, it was my fault, it was my fault. And they can't get unstuck off that. It's almost like a record that's stuck. Mm-hmm. And for listeners who are too young to know what records are, Google it. But it's like a record that skips. And what we're saying here, what I'm hearing you saying, Craig, is we've got to push the needle forward. We've got to get beyond that. And when that happens, that's when resilience can kick in. Our resilience muscle is no longer atrophying, but it's being strengthened. And then that's where we move forward to that second stage that you talked about, which is beyond baseline, going into something new and better.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting in work, you mentioned it yourself, right? That accountability piece. Mm-hmm. And I love, and I'll link it back, Gary, to what you opened with again. I love that you did the connector, right? It's an and. People can look at self-compassion as like, oh, well, I don't want to, absolve myself of that accountability. And that's not, so self-compassion is the balance. It's, hey, I did something, and I did something quite unfortunate. I did something catastrophic, or I was a part of something that was really challenging. And then it's like, and then there are the other side of the equation as well. So, and it's bringing that balanced perspective. And one of the best things, one of the best insights from that research, they'll say, okay, for your listeners who are maybe struggling with self-compassion, one of the best pieces of evidence-informed insight that has come out of that work is that ask yourself, if you're in a space where you're just constantly that self-critical voice is going on ultra blast, ask yourself, what advice would I give to a friend who came to me in the same situation? If they shared exactly, a loved one, a family member, a friend, they presented to me what I'm going through right now, what would I say to them? Would I sound as harsh and be as negative and ruthless in my dialogue? And then if I wouldn't be, so then what makes it okay for me to say this to myself if I wouldn't say it to someone else that I care about?
It's such a good point. One of the other things that it just occurred to me, you talk a lot about, is identity. And I'd be curious to know your thoughts as it relates to resilience, because for some of us, like for me, my whole identity was wrapped up in, the whole family business and being, the heir, at least from my parents' perspective. Well, who am I if that's not me? Now, for me, and everybody has a different faith and value perspective. And we always encourage people to dig deep into whether it's a religious, spiritual, philosophical, whatever that is. For me, what was helpful is I believe, God loves every one of us because of who we are, not because of what we do. And I think most faith and religious perspectives share that philosophical premise. So if you have your identity wrapped up in, oh, I'm a top businessman, or I'm a top professor, or I'm a top tennis player, whatever, it's likely to be somebody better, or somebody, you're never going to be the greatest of all time, at least not for long. And that's debatable in many fields. What does it mean to be the greatest professor of all time? It's not like the easy metric that measures that, right? There's this gold standard that everyone on the planet agrees to. It's not that simple. So talk about how just that identity piece. Because if you have your identity wrapped up in, I'm a good person, I'm a good dad, I'm a good mom, I'm a good professor, I'm a good CEO, my gosh, you're set up for failure, and resilience will be a challenge.
Absolutely. Well, and to link it to, this is one of the primary findings. Let's bring in some more research, right? Which is around job loss. It's one of the reasons why when people lose their jobs, it's one of the most traumatic, stressful, unsettling experiences you can go through. And the reason is it can tackle our sense, it can completely sideswipe our sense of identity. I'm Craig Dowden. I'm a keynote speaker and executive coach. If that's no longer there, who am I? And this is one of the interesting pieces, that our identities are multifaceted, and we can lose sight of that sometimes. And then what can happen is that and if we're all in on one avenue of our identity, then that can be really challenging as well, right? Because then it's all, if I'm not that, well, who am I anymore? So I think the more that we're connected, that identity piece, then the more challenging it can be, because it hits at our heart of resilience.
I mean, one of the questions I'm curious about is, you deal with a lot of CEOs. You obviously coach them in how to help their organizations and their teams have more resilience. I know you've got, several things you say, like what talents do you have? What do you need? I mean, what are some of those key things that leaders of any organization can help their teams be more resilient?
Well, I love that question. And I'll start with, there was fantastic work out of the Center for Creative Leadership, and they separated the difference between pressure and stress. And so they define pressure as the extent of the demands that our external environment places on us. They define stress as our internal ability, our belief in our internal ability to deal with those demands. So this is so powerful, because this exemplifies why two people can go through the same situation and have entirely different stress responses. So for the leaders I work with, the CEOs that I work with, I will talk to them about, and this is borne out in the resilience research as well, taking a resource-based approach and customizing it to every individual employee. So, hey, Craig, how are things going? So checking in. There's lots of data that shows, just checking in and saying, how's everything going today, Gary? How are you doing, Warwick? And then here are the really critical things. What do you need from me as a leader? What do you need from the organization? In what areas are you finding things are going well? Like, you don't need additional support. Being curious, being empathetic, exploring things from a resource perspective, extraordinarily powerful in building resilience in our team members and resilience in our organizations.
I mean, what you're saying is so important, because so often as leaders, we can be all focused on the task. Stuff needs to get done. I mean, look, the world is chaotic and busy. We don't have time for chit chat. And obviously, as you would know, as better than me from the research, it's not always easy to do that on Zoom. There's typically not as much time for water cooler chit chat, how things going. You've got to be more intentional. It doesn't happen by accident, but just asking our people how they're doing. And obviously, it might take a little bit for them to believe you actually care. Hey, how's it going? If my boss asks how's it going, I'm going to say, great, never better. Exactly. Firing on all cylinders. But it's like, okay, great, but how are you really? Eventually, they might actually tell you somewhat, a bit like fishing. Eventually, you'll catch something, and, you've got to have the relationship to have an honest answer. And as you say, then say, well, how can I help? One of the things, separate subject, that I often tell people, if somebody says, well, gosh, I don't know what I'm doing, what would you do in my place? Good leaders don't answer that question. I don't know if that's resilience. It's a separate subject. They say, well, they try to be an executive coach. Well, tell me, what options have you thought of? But
correct.
That's another subject. But I love the fact that you say, well, how can I help? As in, what resources and...
Yeah, and that brings up an excellent point about resilience in general. It's come up a couple of times in this series. And we tend to believe, if we're just doing a drive-by thought about resilience, we think it's all within, right? We say things like, suck it up, or power through, or, you'll figure it out, right? We say those things like all we have to do is dig deeper within. But we've discovered, and I hear you talking about it now, Craig, in the science, we've discovered in talking to guests, it's not just digging deeper within, it's reaching out wider without, externally, to the resources that are out there. So there are resources within and there are resources without. Those two things have to come together for resilience to be robust, right?
Well, I couldn't even have asked you for a better because one of the most scientifically supported resilience building exercise really builds on that, takes that framework. So again, an exercise for your listeners today. So do you want to build resilience? Here's a great way to do it based on the science. So the first step they'll say is think of a challenging situation you've faced in the last 6 weeks, 6 months, doesn't matter what, where you thought that it was impossible. I'm never going to make it through this. And then you made it through. Then you ask yourself 3 critical questions. First question, what strengths did I draw upon? That's really cool because you start to think about, and Gary, I'm going to build on it, right? That internal side. That's an internal resource that you have, my strengths. So great. And how did I leverage them? And this is really interesting because now, hey, this can give me some insight about how I want to apply them right now. Then the second question you ask is that what resources did I draw upon? So this represents the external community. Friends, family, colleagues, did I take a course, read a book, attend a webinar, listen to a podcast, right? All of those things are resources. And then the third question is, what did I learn about myself? So what's so great about these 3 steps, the first question gets us focused internally. What do I have that I bring to the table right now? How does what I have apply to this current situation? Or what other strengths do I have that are better suited in this situation that I'm facing? Same thing with the resource side. What resources did I draw upon? Do they apply in this situation now that I'm facing today? If they don't, what process did I go through to identify the most appropriate resources? And then the last step, which I think is so important as well, what did I learn? I learned that I can overcome a situation that I felt was impossible. And I did it through applying my strengths and drawing and leaning into my community. So if I did it then and I thought it was impossible, why can't I do it now? And I just love that 3-step process because what it does is it reminds us, we move through life so quickly we can forget about our profound successes, how resilient we have been. We have our own data to support it.
Yeah, I mean, that's so good. I mean, it's an excellent question, Gary, about internal, external. Love that framework. I mean, it makes so much sense. And I think as you go through it, not only do you build a stronger resilience muscle, you learn how to handle things better in the future. Okay, maybe not in a blame, but as, Marshall Goldsmith is, one of the most successful coaches out there. He has this phrase that I love called feed forward. Mm-hmm. So what, and I've actually now used that in my own vernacular is, okay, this issue happened. What do we learn from it in terms of doing things better in the future? Focus less on blame, but what do we learn? And so, the internal, the external, I mean, in my own way, if I'm fearful or anxious, I'll, whether it's talk to my wife, if it's a business thing, talk to my team. And then I'm a reflective person, so I love getting advice, at least most of the time anyway. Not bulletproof, but most of the time. And so I'll ask my team. I mean, just in the last couple of days, just this morning, hey, I've got a situation. Asked a couple of members of the team, not quite sure what to do on this. One of them was Gary, and after talking to several different people, it's like, okay, I got a plan. Well, I was pretty anxious about it. I mean, I was losing a little sleep about it, to be honest. It was churning of my mind, and I had to tackle this problem. And fortunately, I have a lot of flaws, but one of the things is I'm not passive in that sense. If there's something wrong, I like to do something about it. But I love what you're saying, the internal mindset shift, which can be, understanding how you're wired. If you're a spiritual person, realize, maybe there's an ultimate plan or hopefully a loving God, asking friends to help you through it. Because one of the things, and I'm sure this hopefully borne out by the research, is when you're going through a challenge that tends to derail you emotionally, you don't think straight. And I don't care if you have a PhD or in my case an MBA, I had an MBA from Harvard. Okay, in theory, I should know a whole lot about business, but I made cataclysmic mistakes. Was it because Harvard's not a good business school? No. It's because I had a bunch of seas of emotions and, stuff from my, honoring my dad that overwhelmed my intelligence and ability to think straight. So anyway, all that's to say is I love that balance between the internal and the external, because one of the things about advice is they're going to be more objective. Maybe it's a slight nuance on this. Talk about how by getting advice, it helps you get some objective information and acknowledge that in some areas of our life, we are not going to be objective, and our brains are just not going to be able to think straight.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think and you captured it quite well around. So everybody around us is going to have a different line of sight on us, and they're not going to have the same potentially not the same emotional connectivity that we will have around the different challenges that we're facing. And then the more we can lean into that support network, right, and ask for their advice, ask them, what would you do in this situation? And this is also really important, and this comes back to building our resilience muscle once again. And I remember speaking to Doug Stone, who wrote the bestseller Difficult Conversations out of Harvard, right? And we were chatting, and he said, just because people provide you with feedback doesn't mean that you have to do anything about it.
Right.
So we're empowered to, and then what you can do is crowdsource lots of different perspectives, lots of different insights, and then we choose the path that authentically connects with who we are. And that's what's so powerful. Once again, once we back to mindset shift, right? Which is, hey, these people are all here trying to give me some insight, some guidance that I can apply to move me ahead in something that's important to me. So why shouldn't I? What's going to prevent me from hearing it? And it is so important. And one other piece, because I love you talked about the support, Warwick. My dissertation on entrepreneurs looked at over 100 entrepreneurs. The top predictor of entrepreneurial success in over 100 entrepreneurs that I studied was level of emotional support received by the people around.
Wow.
It wasn't about it wasn't about business idea. It wasn't about all these other things. Yeah, there were smaller, weaker predictors. None of that. What was crucial was around, did they get support from the people that they cared about most? Were they there to offer a caring ear, some insight, some advice? And I think, again, entrepreneurship, we can feel like, oh, well, we're going it alone. It's all around. No one does. No one is an island. So don't forego the extraordinary strength that we can get from the people around us, as well as the extraordinary insight. So the emotional support, as well as the information, the perspective they can provide, absolutely invaluable.
I know we're getting
sometimes. No, I was going to say it's sometimes difficult in my co-hosting role to know when I jump in and say, that sound you heard was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt signs, and it's getting time where we're going to have to land the plane. The reason why that's normally hard is because the conversations, you have to judge when you think a conversation is kind of coming to its natural conclusion. And what I love about what makes it a little easier for me here is that we've been sort of gathered around different facets of it, but this idea of the elasticity, the two axes on which we find resilience, internal and external, dig deep, reach wide. We've talked great other examples about it, but we've kind of stayed in that zip code for a while. So it seems like a good time to say the captain's getting ready to bring the plane on the ground. Not quite there yet, but before we let Warwick ask you, the last question or two, Craig, I would be remiss in my role if I did not ask you to tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and your services online.
Well, thank you. So you can go to craigdowden.com, and my Forbes talk is there. Lots of articles that I've written for different publications are available that you can access. You can also sign up for my newsletter as well. And there's an assessment online if you want to take it. And happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. Follow me on Twitter. Always love. I have extraordinary passion around the science and practice of positive leadership and resilient leadership. So love opportunities like this to talk about this essential topic and to join, because we're all part of the same community. And I think that's so. Thank you for asking, Gary.
Sure. Warwick, put the wheels on the ground. Ask Craig the last couple questions here.
Well, thanks so much, Craig. I love all your wisdom on resilience. I wanted to ask about the FEAR acronym, but before we do, just one last beat on what you shared. Because some people, when they hear that, well, I'm going to get all this advice and, gee, what do I do with that? I think if you're a leader or really a human, trust your gut, your informed gut, okay? So when you get wise advice, you will know what to take and what not to take. You will know. Trust that, and don't fear advice. You'll know what to discount, and then once you've got informed advice and you're in a relatively level, peaceful place, not in panic mode, trust your ability to make the right decision. Otherwise, the reverse is that way lies madness. I mean, how can you, if you don't trust yourself ever, then, that's not healthy. But anyway, but let's just for this last question, I love this FEAR acronym, false evidence appearing real. Talk about why that's such a valuable concept, this FEAR acronym, as we conclude.
Yeah, no, and thank you. I love the acronym. I share it all the time. And I think we all have fears. Once again, they're there for a reason. And I mentioned Daniel Gilbert out of Harvard earlier and his work, and he talked about anticipatory anxiety is an area of focus, and that our fears. So what can happen is that we fear our fears right now and get all kind of derailed around them. And then in the future, we go through the exact same process again. And what's really powerful about the research, and they've done this in a variety of different domains. One study in particular, they looked at, so what percentage of our fears actually come to fruition? And I could ask you what you think that percentage is. And it's actually less than 10%.
That's amazing.
And then here's what's even more. So ready for the mic drop on this one. Over almost a third of cases, people say it turned out way better than they could have ever imagined. So not only did it not come to pass, which is kind of baseline, in almost a third of cases, it was way better than it was a gift to them. Only in, again, less than 10%. And I think this is really powerful when it comes to, okay, how do we build resilience? Remembering that acronym, false evidence appearing real. So I'll say, okay, great. You have a fear. Don't judge it. Acknowledge it. Write it down. If you've got 1, if you've got 10, don't judge the number of fears you have. And then what you do is systematically walk through each fear and say, what evidence do I have supporting that fear? And then I know what's going to happen is not legitimate evidence. You wouldn't go to a court and say, well, I know, okay, tell me what that is. And then what's really powerful, again, from taking that approach, is that now we can take a more balanced view of what's happening. And we can look at the evidence in the light of day and then say, yeah, now is this just me anticipating worst case scenario, which, as we talked about earlier, is a natural human thing to do? Or is this something legitimate? And if so, now what actions do I take based on my evidence? What do I do to prepare for that? What's the worst case scenario? Okay, so what are going to be my fallback strategies if this comes to fruition? So very, very powerful way of reminding ourselves what fears actually are.
The great thing about this discussion on fear here at the tail end, and yes, the captain has put the plane down on the tarmac, but why I love that discussion at the end of this conversation about harnessing resilience is that everything that you just described about fear is a roadblock to resilience. If you're caught in fear at any of those points, if you're trapped in those kinds of things, fear can block us from pursuing resilience. To use your words, Craig, can block us from exercising, can keep us out of the gym, keep us from exercising that resilience muscle. Speaking of exercising your resilience muscle, listeners, we hope you have had a chance to do that over the last 5 weeks that we've had the series Harnessing Resilience going on. We will now turn next week to the 6th episode of this series. And that is where Warwick and I are going to talk about everything we've learned from all of our guests, all 5 of our guests now that we've had. We're going to pull out the key learnings, the key insights and action steps that you can take to As you move on beyond your crucible, harness resilience on your own.